February 2026. Russia's war machine continues to burn through nearly $170 billion every year, devouring close to 30% of the entire federal budget in its grinding campaign against Ukraine. What was once projected as a short, decisive operation has become an endless drain on the state's finances, manpower, and long-term stability. Oil revenues, the backbone of Moscow's imperial ambitions for decades, have sharply declined. In a single year, energy income fell by roughly 25%. Russian crude, once a pillar of global markets, now sells at steep discounts, at times around $39 per barrel, far below what the Kremlin needs to comfortably finance both domestic programs and foreign wars. At the same time, Ukrainian drones strike refineries, storage facilities, and tankers with increasing precision. Energy infrastructure inside Russia faces repeated disruptions. Fuel shortages ripple through regions far from the battlefield. Industrial facilities struggle with inconsistent supply. Production capacity weakens. The broader economy bleeds slowly but steadily. To compensate, Moscow raises taxes and fees, pressing businesses and households already under strain. Companies face higher costs and tighter margins. Consumers feel the squeeze as prices rise faster than wages. Official figures attempt to project resilience, yet economic growth has plunged from around 4% to under 1%. What appears as stability is largely fueled by military expenditure, masking an underlying recession in the civilian sector. The Russian central bank keeps interest rates high, around 16%, in a bid to contain inflationary pressure. But such high borrowing costs suffocate private investment. Entrepreneurs delay expansion. Civilian industries shrink. Defense factories operating around the clock absorb labor, capital, and raw materials. The war economy consumes nearly everything, leaving little for ordinary citizens. International markets offer little relief. India, once a major buyer of discounted Russian crude, shifts away under new trade arrangements with the United States. More than 1 million barrels per day disappear from Russia's export channels. China has already increased imports to near capacity, leaving Moscow with few alternatives. New customers are scarce and global leverage diminishes. Alexander Gabuev, a Russian foreign policy analyst living in exile, describes the war as a dark void, swallowing the nation's resources and influence. Russia's global standing erodes. Longtime partners distance themselves. The image of a resurgent empire fades, replaced by isolation and overextension. Across the geopolitical landscape, former allies falter. The Assad regime in Syria collapses. Venezuela's leadership faces dramatic upheaval. Iran confronts waves of domestic unrest. Moscow appears increasingly unable to stabilize or protect its partners. The perception of a reliable power broker weakens. The structure of influence painstakingly built over decades shows visible cracks. The latest American national defense strategy reflects this shift, redefining Russia not as a peer superpower, but as a constrained regional challenge. For a state that invested years projecting itself as a global counterweight to the West, the downgrade carries symbolic and strategic weight. Inside the Kremlin, messaging splits into contradictions. Diplomatic figures attempt to present flexibility in international talks, suggesting pathways to negotiation. Simultaneously, official rhetoric demands sweeping concessions from Ukraine: neutrality, demilitarization, territorial surrender, and political restructuring. Yet, as battlefield realities worsen, maximalist demands ring increasingly hollow. Security Council officials revive nuclear rhetoric, warning of dire consequences if NATO forces expand involvement. However, repeated threats lose credibility when not matched by decisive escalation. Observers note that constant saber-rattling without follow-through diminishes deterrent value. On the battlefield, casualty figures mount at a staggering pace. Western intelligence assessments suggest that Russian forces suffer losses measured in the thousands per week. In some months, totals reach levels rarely seen in modern conventional warfare. Comparisons are drawn to historical conflicts, where similar losses occurred over much longer periods. Beyond statistics lies a profound demographic challenge. A generation of young men is removed from the workforce and society. Long-term population decline, already a concern before the war, accelerates. The social and economic consequences may persist for decades. Independent Russian journalists report troubling accounts from the front lines. Investigations describe instances of harsh disciplinary practices within certain units, including allegations of extreme coercion. Soldiers reportedly face pressure from both the dangers ahead and strict enforcement from behind. Morale suffers. Trust erodes. Reports also detail makeshift detention areas near combat zones, where those accused of insubordination are confined under severe conditions. Public punishment is allegedly used as a deterrent. Analysts warn that such practices signal strain within the military structure and weaken professional standards. Recruitment patterns reflect similar stress. Large numbers of prisoners have reportedly been offered contracts promising reduced sentences in exchange for military service. Special assault units composed of convicts receive minimal training before deployment to high-risk sectors. While this strategy temporarily fills manpower gaps, it raises questions about cohesion and effectiveness. Elite formations that once symbolized Russian military prestige, airborne units, special forces, and private military contractors, have endured heavy attrition. Leadership losses and restructuring alter command dynamics. Institutional experience thins. Regional governments offer substantial financial incentives to attract volunteers. Sign-on bonuses rise into the millions of rubles. Wealthier regions struggle to recruit locally despite generous offers. Appeals to patriotism appear less persuasive than financial necessity. As costs mount, the state prints money to sustain expenditures. Inflation pressures build. The civilian economy feels increasingly fragile. With prison recruitment pools shrinking and voluntary enlistment slowing, authorities explore alternative mobilization mechanisms. Unlike the partial mobilization announced publicly in 2022, newer approaches are more discreet. Analysts describe a rolling system that integrates digital government platforms. Through centralized databases, draft notifications can be delivered electronically. Administrative penalties follow quickly for noncompliance. Restricted travel, suspended licenses, frozen financial access. The process operates quietly, minimizing public spectacle. Observers note that this digital enforcement alters the social contract. For years, many citizens believed political disengagement guaranteed personal stability. As mobilization expands into major urban centers and professional sectors, that assumption weakens. Highly educated workers, engineers, IT specialists, technicians, find themselves increasingly vulnerable to conscription. Demographic pressures compound the strain. Independent estimates suggest that over 1 million Russians have been killed, wounded, or permanently left the country since the war began. Emigration drains skilled professionals. Industries beyond defense struggle to replace lost expertise. Factories tied to the war effort operate continuously, drawing labor away from construction, agriculture, and manufacturing. Fields remain underworked. Infrastructure projects stall. To offset shortages, Russia imports laborers from parts of South Asia and Africa. Yet skill mismatches create new obstacles. Operating advanced machinery in defense plants requires specialized training not easily replaced. Language barriers and technical gaps reduce efficiency. Production quality concerns emerge. Meanwhile, ammunition expenditure on the battlefield continues at a rate that challenges domestic output. The imbalance between consumption and manufacturing capacity widens over time. Taken together, these dynamics paint a picture of a state under cumulative pressure, economically, demographically, militarily, and diplomatically. The war persists, but its long-term cost grows heavier each month. Whether the system can adapt fast enough to stabilize itself remains an open question, as the strain touches nearly every sector of Russian society. The state that invaded Ukraine, proclaiming the rebirth of a great Russian empire, now finds itself recruiting South Asian laborers just to keep basic services functioning. Bakeries in regional cities rely increasingly on migrant workers, while Russia's own young bakers are deployed to the front lines near places like Pokrovsk. The symbolism is stark. Citizens once promised imperial restoration are dying in trenches, while foreign labor fills the gaps at home. At the same time, Russia imports ammunition from countries such as North Korea and Iran. Reports indicate that some shipments suffer from inconsistent quality and higher failure rates compared to domestic production. For a country that once projected itself as a military-industrial powerhouse, reliance on heavily sanctioned states for artillery shells and rockets represents a profound strategic embarrassment. Iranian-designed drones, particularly variants derived from the Shahed series, are now assembled in Russian facilities. While reverse engineering has allowed domestic production, manufacturing inconsistencies and supply shortages complicate output. Critical electronic components are sourced through complex sanctions, evasion networks, driving costs far above standard market prices. What would normally be routine procurement has become an expensive logistical puzzle. The result is a war economy that spends faster than energy exports can replenish. Even when oil revenues stabilize temporarily, hidden costs of procurement and financial rerouting continue to drain resources. Compounding these pressures, approximately $300 billion in Russian foreign reserves remain frozen in Western financial institutions. Those assets, once intended as a buffer against crisis, are inaccessible. Moscow increasingly turns to the Chinese renminbi and alternative financial instruments to manage trade settlements. However, Chinese banks proceed cautiously, aware that overt facilitation risks secondary sanctions. Financial workarounds exist, but their scale and flexibility remain limited. The broader strategic relationship between Moscow and Beijing has shifted. Where Russia once positioned itself as an equal partner, it now appears increasingly dependent. Energy exports to China are sold at steep discounts. Beijing leverages Moscow's isolation to secure favorable terms on long-term supply agreements and infrastructure projects. The power dynamic has tilted noticeably. In Central Asia, Chinese influence expands steadily through Belt and Road Initiative investments. Railways, pipelines, and industrial projects increasingly tie regional economies to Beijing rather than Moscow. Kazakhstan, historically within Russia's orbit, strengthens links with China. The use of the Russian language declines in certain sectors, symbolizing a gradual cultural and geopolitical shift. Events in the South Caucasus further expose limitations. The Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict revealed Russia's reduced capacity to guarantee security outcomes favorable to its allies. Peacekeeping efforts struggled to enforce stability. Armenian political leaders openly questioned the reliability of Russian security commitments, signaling erosion of influence. Moldova progresses in its European Union accession path, even as Russian forces remain present in Transnistria. These developments suggest that Moscow's leverage is no longer sufficient to halt Western integration trends in its near abroad. Independent research by media organizations indicates that confirmed Russian military deaths may approach 160,000, with broader estimates reaching far higher. Senior officer casualties are notable, including multiple generals, a rare occurrence in modern warfare. Analysts attribute these losses to operational challenges, rigid command structures, and systemic corruption that weakened preparedness. Despite years of fighting, Russia has not secured control over all the regional capitals and territories it claims. Territorial gains, though present, fall short of initial objectives. Domestically, the war is framed as an existential struggle. Internationally, progress appears incremental relative to cost. State messaging increasingly incorporates religious rhetoric. Officials and influential public figures describe the campaign as a civilizational or spiritual mission. Such narratives attempt to provide moral framing for geopolitical ambition. Critics argue that spiritual language masks strategic miscalculation. Within Russia's elite circles, asset seizures and anti-corruption investigations have consolidated loyalty. Confiscations worth billions of rubles increase dependence on Kremlin protection. Western sanctions, freezing overseas assets, further limit options for elites who once diversified wealth abroad. The war has effectively trapped much of the ruling class financially within national borders. This dynamic reduces the likelihood of open elite rebellion. While reports suggest some officials privately opposed escalation, coordinated resistance remains improbable. Political survival hinges on alignment with the central leadership. Individual dissent carries high personal risk, and collective organization is structurally difficult. Policy institutes observe that although the regime faces pressure, it is not on the verge of sudden collapse, reminiscent of 1917 or 1991. However, multiple stress factors, economic contraction, demographic strain, military attrition, and quiet elite frustration accumulate simultaneously. Over time, intersecting crises may widen internal fault lines. Capital flight patterns and sudden property sales indicate uncertainty among certain business circles. Regional officials grapple with budget shortfalls as federal transfers prioritize defense spending. Infrastructure maintenance and social programs face cuts, potentially fueling localized dissatisfaction. Western assessments estimate total casualties, killed and wounded combined, exceeding 1 million. The financial cost per square kilometer of territory gained is extraordinarily high. Russia currently controls roughly 18% of Ukrainian territory, gains achieved at immense human and economic expense. Militarily, Russia reorganizes command structures, reestablishing districts near its northwestern frontier. Infrastructure development near the Finnish border signals, intent to reinforce posture against NATO expansion. Satellite imagery shows new facilities and brigades positioned strategically, reinforcing deterrence narratives. Hybrid tactics continue along NATO's eastern flank. Incidents involving drones and airspace probes test alliance responses. NATO members strengthen defensive coordination in response to perceived threats. The security environment grows more volatile. In the Black Sea, Russia's fleet has endured significant setbacks. The sinking of the cruiser Moskva and damage to other vessels altered naval dynamics. Ukrainian strikes in Crimea repeatedly target strategic infrastructure, including facilities in Sevastopol and the Kerch Bridge. What was once a secure rear area now demands constant defense. Annexed territories experience persistent resistance. Sabotage operations disrupt logistics. Local populations often remain hostile. Maintaining administrative control requires sustained security presence, adding to occupation costs. The Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant remains under Russian control, raising ongoing international concern. The International Atomic Energy Agency monitors conditions, warning of risks associated with military activity around sensitive infrastructure. The facility represents both leverage and liability. Domestically, official approval ratings for leadership remain high according to state polling. Yet independent verification is limited. Fear, propaganda, saturation, and the absence of competitive media complicate interpretation. Independent polling organizations face restrictions, limiting transparent assessment of public sentiment. Leaked surveys suggest generational divides. Younger Russians, particularly in urban centers, express more skepticism privately than older cohorts. While overt protest remains rare due to legal consequences, underlying attitudes may shift gradually. The cumulative picture is complex. Russia retains significant military capacity and political control, yet faces mounting structural pressures. Economic strain, demographic loss, strategic dependence on China, and battlefield attrition intersect in ways that challenge long-term sustainability. The war that began as a bid for imperial resurgence has evolved into a test of endurance. Whether the current system can absorb prolonged pressure without transformative change remains uncertain. What is clear is that the costs, human, financial, and geopolitical, continue to rise, reshaping Russia's trajectory in ways that may define its future for decades. The movement built around Alexei Navalny has been severely suppressed, but it has not disappeared. Public demonstrations have been crushed, organizations dismantled, and leaders imprisoned or exiled. Yet underground networks remain active in quiet, decentralized forms. Opposition sentiment continues to exist beneath the surface despite harsh repression. Memorial, one of Russia's most respected human rights organizations, was forcibly shut down, symbolizing the broader destruction of organized civil society. Reports from former detainees and international observers document mistreatment and torture of political prisoners. Navalny's death in prison under suspicious circumstances triggered global condemnation, yet the Kremlin showed no indication of altering its course. Instead, repression intensified. Critics are labeled extremists, independent media outlets silenced, and legal mechanisms weaponized to eliminate dissent systematically. The Russian Orthodox Church leadership has publicly framed the war in spiritual terms. Patriarch Kirill has blessed troops and described the conflict as a sacred struggle. This religious endorsement offers moral justification to supporters. However, divisions exist within the clergy. Some priests quietly object to the blending of faith and military aggression, creating subtle but growing schisms inside religious communities. Ethnic minorities have borne a disproportionate share of casualties. Regions such as Dagestan, Chechnya, and Buryatia report higher loss rates compared to major urban centers like Moscow or St. Petersburg. Families in these regions increasingly question why their sons are dying in large numbers. Underlying ethnic and regional tensions, long present in the Federation, risk deepening as losses accumulate. Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov continues to publicly affirm loyalty to the Kremlin, deploying regional units to reinforce federal objectives. Yet casualties among Chechen forces mount as well. Persistent rumors about Kadyrov's health create uncertainty regarding succession. Stability in Chechnya has long depended on his personal authority. Without it, future cohesion remains unclear. Russia's demographic crisis predates the war but has accelerated dramatically. Birth rates have declined for years, and wartime fatalities combined with emigration intensify the trend. The working-age population continues shrinking, placing enormous pressure on economic growth prospects. Long-term demographic projections appear increasingly severe. Migration flows have reversed. Young, educated professionals leave in search of security and opportunity abroad, while older generations remain. This imbalance worsens dependency ratios, placing strain on pension systems and social welfare programs. Without structural reform or population stabilization, sustainability becomes doubtful. Public health indicators add further strain. Rates of HIV and tuberculosis show worrying increases in certain regions. The healthcare system, already underfunded outside major cities, struggles to meet demand. Veterans return from the front with untreated trauma. Post-traumatic stress disorder, substance abuse, and family instability rise quietly but steadily. Reintegration programs for returning soldiers remain limited in scope and funding. Psychological support services are insufficient relative to need. Thousands of combat-experienced individuals re-enter civilian life, carrying physical injuries and emotional scars. If left unaddressed, this dynamic could present long-term domestic security challenges. Military cemeteries expand across the country. Satellite imagery reveals new burial plots appearing with increasing frequency. Families often receive sealed coffins, and official casualty numbers remain disputed. Compensation payments are sometimes delayed, adding financial strain to grief. Investigative journalists and international organizations continue documenting alleged war crimes, including reports of torture and civilian executions. The International Criminal Court has issued an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin, restricting his travel options to states that reject enforcement. While Russia dismisses the court's authority, legal exposure for senior officials has grown. Putin's personal legal risk on the international stage increases as investigations proceed. Diplomatic isolation deepens. Senior commanders could face future prosecutions if political circumstances shift. Evidence collection continues, preserving records of decision-making chains. Russia's long-term future depends significantly on how and when the war ends. Continued conflict promises further economic erosion, demographic decline, and international isolation. Yet compromise appears politically difficult. The leadership has tied its legitimacy closely to military objectives, making visible concessions domestically risky. Regime survival hinges on avoiding the perception of defeat. In such an environment, even stalemate can be framed as resistance against external pressure. This dynamic prolongs confrontation without delivering resolution. Many analysts argue the current trajectory cannot continue indefinitely. Economic constraints are measurable. Human capital losses accumulate. International influence narrows. Former partners distance themselves. The question increasingly centers not on whether strain exists, but on how long the system can absorb it. Recent regional data show enlistment bonuses rising to unprecedented levels. Belgorod reportedly offers millions of rubles for contracts. Moscow provides even higher incentives. Such payments, while temporarily effective in recruitment, contribute to inflationary pressures. The federal budget deficit widens quarter by quarter. Tax revenue fails to keep pace with expenditure. Domestic borrowing increases, raising debt service costs. Historically, oil and gas revenues funded a majority of the budget. Now their share has fallen substantially, leaving gaps. Sanctions restrict access to global capital markets. External borrowing options are minimal. Domestic pension funds have been tapped to support state financing needs. Financial maneuvering space narrows as economic flexibility declines. Defense production struggles to meet ambitious targets. This reliance contradicts narratives of self-sufficiency. Industrial accidents and communication problems inside factories rise as labor shortages deepen. Foreign workers fill some roles, yet technical barriers reduce efficiency. Quality control inconsistencies affect output reliability. Meeting military demand consistently remains challenging. Civilian life reflects parallel strain. Western consumer brands have exited the market. Domestic alternatives exist, but often lack comparable quality or availability. Black markets expand to satisfy demand for restricted goods. Prices rise, while purchasing power weakens. The pharmaceutical sector faces particular difficulty. Western suppliers have curtailed shipments. Generic replacements do not fully cover treatment needs. Patients report shortages of critical medications. The healthcare system absorbs additional stress with limited resources. Financial isolation compounds these challenges. Russian banks are largely disconnected from the SWIFT international payment system. Cross-border transactions become complex and costly. Businesses encounter obstacles in securing trade finance. International card networks such as Visa and MasterCard ceased operations within Russia, increasing reliance on domestic systems with limited global reach. Taken together, these trends reveal a society under sustained multidimensional pressure. Political repression secures short-term stability, but economic contraction, demographic decline, social fragmentation, and international isolation converge simultaneously. While centralized authority remains intact, underlying vulnerabilities grow more pronounced. Civil society structures have been dismantled, yet dissent simmers quietly. Regional inequalities widen, public health strains deepen. The war shapes not only foreign policy, but the internal architecture of the state itself. The future remains uncertain. Systems can endure stress longer than observers predict, especially when control mechanisms are strong. Yet mathematics, demographics, and resource flows impose boundaries that cannot be ignored indefinitely. Russia stands at a crossroads shaped by cumulative choices. The longer the conflict persists, the more profound the structural consequences become. Whether adaptation, reform, or further consolidation defines the next chapter will determine the country's trajectory for generations to come. The Russian shipping and logistics sector has collapsed under unprecedented pressure. Western ports increasingly refuse entry to Russian vessels, while insurance costs for those that can operate legally have reached astronomical levels. Poland closed crossings entirely, Finland reinforced its frontiers, and the Baltic states reject Russian cargo without exception. The annexed territories in eastern and southern Ukraine represent an immense drain on Russian resources. Mariupol, Donetsk, and Luhansk have been devastated by prolonged fighting. Infrastructure is destroyed, populations have largely fled, and reconstruction costs are staggering. The economic value of holding these regions is negligible, rendering the so-called strategic gains Pyrrhic. Internationally, the legitimacy of these annexations is not recognized. The United Nations condemned Russia's actions, and the European Union imposed sweeping sanctions. Russia finds itself diplomatically isolated with virtually no recognition of its claimed territories. Any notion of strategic advantage has been replaced by a costly, unsustainable occupation. Meanwhile, domestic opposition is quietly growing, particularly among younger generations. Internal surveys indicate rising resistance to the war among youth, especially in urban centers. The internet exposes the gaps in state propaganda, and social media channels, while censored, circulate narratives undermining official messaging. Yet public dissent is currently suppressed through brutal measures. The Federal Security Service, FSB, has expanded surveillance exponentially. Arrests are often arbitrary, trials predetermined, and prison sentences severe. A climate of terror keeps the population largely obedient, but opposition networks have been forced deeper underground, surviving in clandestine, decentralized forms. Internationally, Russia's efforts to secure political support are faltering. India, while purchasing discounted Russian oil, maintains a careful stance of strategic autonomy, avoiding endorsement of Moscow's invasion. Brazil and several other global South nations refuse both condemnation and explicit support, prioritizing their own interests. Russia's global South strategy, intended to secure allies and bypass Western isolation, is failing. Cheap energy purchases have not translated into political backing. Transactional relationships abound, but strategic partnerships are increasingly absent. Russia's domestic economy has suffered broad collapse. Tourism has ended, students studying abroad have declined, and scientific collaboration with international institutions has effectively ceased. The technology and innovation sectors have been decimated, creating a deepening brain drain as educated professionals flee permanently. Domestic aviation faces severe crisis. Boeing and Airbus spare parts have ceased flowing, grounding commercial aircraft. Equipment maintenance suffers as spare parts are unavailable, forcing hospitals to rely on aging machinery. Diagnostic capabilities have been reduced, patient outcomes are worsening, and the system is under chronic strain. Pharmaceutical shortages affect essential medications, and Western producers no longer supply replacements. The combined effect is a health crisis stretching beyond the battlefield. Financially, Russia is isolated from international banking systems, including SWIFT, rendering cross-border payments and trade finance complex and costly. Visa and MasterCard no longer operate domestically, forcing reliance on limited domestic financial alternatives. Insurance and reinsurance markets are largely inaccessible, leaving critical infrastructure and commerce uninsured, increasing systemic fragility. Internally, partisan resistance in occupied territories remains active. Underground sabotage, attacks on collaborators, and administrative disruptions persist. Russian governance remains tenuous. Populations in annexed regions are hostile and resistant. Public sentiment within Russia itself is opaque. Polling under authoritarian conditions is unreliable. State propaganda dominates public narratives, while independent measurement has been obstructed. The true extent of opposition is difficult to gauge, yet suppression is ongoing, systematic, and effective in maintaining surface-level stability. Demographic decline continues at an alarming rate. The war has exacerbated an existing demographic winter. Population shrinkage, fueled by casualties, immigration, and declining birth rates, presents long-term structural challenges. Economic consequences are projected to span decades, with recovery appearing unlikely even if hostilities end. Human capital losses are compounded by the exodus of educated professionals, the aging of the workforce, and the depletion of younger generations through military mobilization and battlefield casualties. Military operations, initially expected to achieve swift success, have instead devolved into protracted attrition. From February 2022, when the Kremlin launched the special military operation, expectations were for rapid decapitation of Ukrainian command structures, quick occupation of Kiev, and the installation of a compliant government. Those assumptions collapsed rapidly. 3 years later, Russian forces remain mired in conflict, suffering mounting casualties, resource depletion, and strategic humiliation. Allies have abandoned Moscow, international isolation has deepened, and the economy is under severe strain. Each assumption about victory proved flawed. Each calculation misjudged the resilience of Ukrainian resistance. Initial Russian offensives relied on rapid airborne operations and armored thrusts aimed at seizing critical points, such as Hostomel Airport and Kiev. These assaults failed catastrophically. Elite VDV paratroopers suffered heavy losses, armored columns were decimated, and northern offensive lines collapsed, forcing humiliating retreats from Kiev and surrounding regions. Commanders were fired in the aftermath, and operational morale plummeted. Subsequent operations shifted focus to the Donbas industrial region, including a protracted siege of Mariupol. The city was devastated, defenders held out for months, and eventual surrender brought only Pyrrhic victory. Resources were consumed entirely, human costs enormous, and infrastructure irreparably damaged. Kharkiv became the site of another failed offensive, as Ukrainian counterattacks in September 2022 routed Russian units, abandoned equipment in disarray, and broadcast humiliation globally. Withdrawals from Kherson and right bank Dnipro demonstrated the limits of territorial gains and the growing futility of the campaign. Bakhmut turned into a grinding attrition zone. Wagner Group forces led repeated assaults, sustaining tens of thousands of casualties over months before eventual capture in May 2023. Strategic value remained highly questionable. In June 2023, the Wagner mutiny revealed profound systemic fragility. Columns of Wagner fighters marched toward Moscow, forcing the president into temporary disappearance, negotiation, and ultimately, a mysterious death of their leader in a plane crash. Ukrainian counteroffensives in summer 2023 failed to breach heavily mined Russian lines, resulting in stalemated attrition warfare. The front lines became zones of unrelenting slaughter where both sides endured heavy losses. Russian military logistics and doctrine have faltered repeatedly. Combined arms operations, armor, infantry, artillery, and aviation were planned but seldom achieved. Units operate independently, air support is largely absent, and coordination remains fragmented. Ukrainian forces exploit NATO tactics, drone capabilities, and precision strikes, continuously adapting faster than Russian units. Artillery ammunition is critically constrained. Stockpiles deplete faster than replenishment, forcing reliance on North Korean imports with inconsistent quality. Over 3,000 tanks have been destroyed or rendered inoperable, with outdated T-54 and T-55 models resurrected from museums to fill gaps. Rail-dependent supply lines are vulnerable to Ukrainian interdiction, while trucks cannot compensate, leaving front lines undersupplied. Command structure dysfunction compounds these problems. Officers are often appointed based on loyalty rather than competence. Corruption is endemic, and false reporting skews decision-making. Morale collapses as soldiers recognize lies, inadequate equipment, insufficient training, and unrelenting exposure to a technologically superior enemy. Medieval practices such as barrier troops are reintroduced, executing retreating or non-compliant soldiers, maintaining order through fear rather than professionalism. Alcohol, drugs, and disciplinary breakdowns are pervasive. The army holds together only through terror. Professional military cohesion is effectively dissolved. Meanwhile, Ukrainian forces continuously evolve. Western training and equipment provide adaptive advantages. NATO-inspired tactics, precision weaponry, and drone technology enhance operational effectiveness. Russian military adaptation is hindered by rigid hierarchical doctrine, suppression of initiative, and institutional sclerosis. Bureaucratic paralysis and corruption exacerbate systemic inefficiency. Domestic defense industry struggles to produce sufficient output, constrained by sanctions, component shortages, and technological gaps. Despite propaganda claims, production quality and reliability decline, leaving the military dependent on foreign sources.